Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome back to Access to Democracy. And welcome back to Steve Franscisco, who knows more about the federal budget and the debt ceiling and financial matters than just about anybody I know. Until recently, you were the federal policy director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And you're the first guest that we have had who actually appears in my new book, which just is out this week. You Can Make a Difference. And like so many of our guests, you can and did make a difference, and you're continuing to do so. Also teaches an adjunct at Hamline University, Hamline. And tell us about the mess that we're in. Tell us about the deficit. Tell us about what led us into this deficit and what we have to look down the road unless our philosophy changes with regard to government.
Wow, Alan. We're really going to cut right to the chase today.
Cut right to the chase.
We are in a very difficult predicament. We have unemployment over 9% nationally, a little bit better here in Minnesota, about 2 points under the national average. Lots of Americans who don't show up in the unemployment figures because they've been looking for so long for work that frankly they've become discouraged and stopped looking. And we're talking here about, perhaps millions more people that aren't reflected in the official figures who have been looking for a job for over 2 years, sometimes over 3 years. A very difficult situation. We have an economy where growth is very flat right now, and we risk falling back into negative growth, which would be the definition of a recession. We have housing values that continue to fall across the country, including in many of the largest urban areas in America. And think of the repercussions of just on the housing market for a moment, if we could. That for most Americans, that represents the biggest chunk of their personal wealth, is the value of the home that they own. And so for many people across the country, that's terrible news.
This mortgage scam,
yep.
In which millions of people lost their homes. I had a son who lost his home because of the mortgage crisis.
Yeah.
And the banks yet seem to be walking fault-free.
Well, one critique I would have of the Obama administration is, they came to the rescue as they needed to, I think, of the banking system. Otherwise, our economic collapse would have really been horrible after 2008. They had to do something to save the financial system. They did that, but they should have been much tougher, frankly, on the banks and lending institutions and mortgage companies that profited when times were good, but lured a lot of people into mortgages that weren't sustainable.
And now, when they've been bailed out, they're sitting on trillions of dollars of money that they could be using to put back into the economy to help people, and they're afraid to invest it simply because they have to answer to their stockholders, which is just a ludicrous heartless situation.
Well, there needs to be a circumstance where the administration takes charge here and says to the banks, look, part of the deal for rescuing you was that you were going to have to work with these people who were underwater on their mortgages and losing their houses in foreclosure, and they didn't do nearly enough in that realm that they should have, I think. But you know, another part of this larger financial mess that we're in is this growing national debt and increasing federal deficits. And you know, we're talking about an economy that's about $14.5 trillion of gross domestic product a year, and now talking about a national debt that is over $15 trillion in that neighborhood. And the issue is going to be, how do you start to pay down some of that debt without making the cure worse than the disease? In other words, penalizing middle income and low income families.
One way
and
would
letting
be to do what Obama has tried to do, and what actually Governor Dayton tried to do also, which is what I call level the playing field,
Right.
so that a small percentage of people don't pay less in taxes and get much more benefit than the suffering middle class
Right.
and the great middle class.
Well, part of the debt ceiling agreement that was reached, and you know, we watched this debacle of a negotiation throughout the summer where they risked the full faith and credit of the United States government. If we had defaulted there, it would have been an economic calamity.
Bad enough that they took us down a peg.
That's right. Part of that deal, though, was this long-term deficit reduction commission that's been created, the so-called super committee. And the big question on the table right now is, are we going to have a balanced approach, such as what you just alluded to, that considers new revenues in addition to appropriate spending cuts? You know, nobody says there aren't areas in the federal budget where we can cut back spending. But to focus all of those cuts in the discretionary portion of the budget, which discretionary simply means that those are budget items that Congress makes a determination every year on an annual basis about how much money they're going to spend for that particular activity. It's things like federal law enforcement, aid to education, medical and scientific research, environmental protection. That only constitutes about 15% of the budget. And so to those people in Congress who are saying we need a cuts-only approach that doesn't consider any new tax revenue whatsoever,
And doesn't cut the defense budget.
and
Those
doesn't
same
cut the
people,
defense budget, if
which
we
is
go down
gigantic.
that path, you are inevitably talking about potentially massive cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, and possibly Social Security as well, because the math just is not there. You can't get there from here if your approach is only cuts. We have to look at revenue as well.
So tell us, and I know you have a new report with you, which really substantiates how we got into this mess. And we hear all these people who say no new taxes, who are trying to tie the president's hands, who are trying to tie the governor's hands. Who got us into this mess, and what is responsible?
Well, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C., who I've done a lot of work with previously in my career.
Nonpartisan, I might add.
They are, although they are seen by, you know, some analysts as being more on the progressive side, having a little more perspective from that political angle. But they came out with a report just last week, which points out, and I'm going to read from this because I want to get these numbers right, just two policies dating from the Bush administration, the 2001-2003 tax cuts and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, accounted for over $500 billion of the deficit in 2009 and will account for $7 trillion in deficits for the 10 years from 2009 to 2019, including associated debt service costs. By 2019, these two policies will account for almost half, or nearly $10 trillion of the $20 trillion in debt that will be owed under current policies. In other words, if we don't change any tax or spending policies. And so, you know, clearly to look at that and to say, well, what we need to do is really decimate spending on domestic priorities for education, healthcare, affordable housing, environmental protection, all these things we need to do. Infrastructure development, which we know about firsthand here in Minnesota with the bridge falling a few years ago. If you take that approach, it's a very unbalanced approach, and it doesn't get you close to solving that debt problem. Revenues have to be part of the solution. And it simply is unfair to say that the wealthiest people in this country who benefited from those 2001 and 2003 tax cuts should be held harmless while you impose cuts on students in financial aid, senior citizens on Medicare. You know, we had this proposal by Representative Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, back in April, where he proposed turning Medicare into a voucher program and Medicaid into a block grant program where states would basically get an amount of money that would be capped.
Let's call it like it is.
Terrible
That's privatizing them.
That's
taking
right.
it out of government where it's inexpensive and privatizing it so that they can bleed even more.
Yeah.
Private industry can bleed even more out of the people who
Not
are
a fair
participating.
approach. And I don't think, frankly, I'll tell you just a political comment for a second, if I might. I don't think the American people support that. I think the opinion polling I've seen says that people believe that taxes on the very wealthiest people in this country should be raised a little bit to help us deal with this situation. You know, there's this mythology that seems to be rampant in the country that if we raise taxes on the very wealthiest people in the country, we're going to sink the American economy, or if we retract the 2001-2003 tax cuts.
That's the Bush, not the Bush, the Reagan trickle-down theory. And the fact of the matter is that it doesn't trickle down. We have seen from experience that giving a break to the highest income people does not trickle down into the economy. It means jobs.
Well,
what
Alan,
it means is corporations send jobs overseas. What it means is corporations move their headquarters overseas. What it means is corporations don't pay taxes. ExxonMobil, $14 billion in profits. And I can name one after another, not just petroleum companies. If in fact we handled some of those things, to me, we would alleviate a large part of our problem.
I think that's right. And I think, you know, just looking back at history, you can't just, this flies in the face of a lot of the political rhetoric that we're hearing in the presidential campaign right now.
doesn't want to look at history.
One of the things they're saying is that whenever you raise taxes, you're going to stifle economic growth. That's not what the historical record says, and the Congressional Budget Office looks to the example of the Clinton administration in 1992-93 when they actually raised taxes a little bit on the highest income households.
70%.
And we had a decade.
70% they were paying then, they're paying 35%
that's
now.
Right. We had a decade, though, of strong economic growth. Now, it is true, the world changed after September 11th. We have additional responsibilities that our government has to meet to take care of our veterans who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Two wars that we should not be in
Two
my
wars that have
estimation.
produced a lot of people with severe injuries that we're going to have to care for these people for a long time. And you know, to say that we should not raise any revenue to accomplish that, it just strikes me as wrong. And I don't think the American people support that position either. I think we have responsibilities. Nobody has ever said that government should do everything, but the things that government must do, we have to pay for. And there's just no way around that reality.
And of course, there's the other philosophy, as I have heard in some of the Republican debates, where, and this is far off track, but where a decorated Marine officer admits that he's gay, and he gets booed by this lunatic fringe called the Tea Party, where we've had other instances of people, for instance, when Ron Paul was talking about the medical situation and somebody called out, let him die.
Yeah, because he didn't have insurance,
because
the
he didn't have
hypothetical
insurance.
question. Right.
This to me is representative of a lunatic fringe that has grabbed control of government, and if we don't grab it back, we're really facing an abyss.
Well, I would just observe on that last point on the health care, you know, many of the people who are calling for repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and they keep calling it Obamacare, and they say, we want to repeal this, that's our highest priority. And then when you start asking them about certain provisions in it, like the insurance reforms that say insurance companies shouldn't be able to kick you off for a pre-existing medical condition, that say that parents ought to be able to carry their kids up to age 26, they say, well, I'm for that. Of course, the problem is, when they were in the majority in Congress previously, they didn't do any of that.
That's
They
correct.
didn't pass any of that legislation. So here you have it in law, but they want to throw the whole thing out and start over again. And you know, just remember this, a key figure, 31 million Americans who don't have a dime of health insurance today, by 2014 would be covered under the Affordable Care Act. That's a significant expansion of coverage. And you know, for the wealthiest, most affluent country in the world, America, USA #1, to say that we have had, as we have recently, 47 million Americans with no health insurance, that's outrageous. And that's something that should be, as a matter of public policy, should be unacceptable to all of us, because frankly, it's been driving healthcare costs through the roof. This uncompensated care when people get sick and have no insurance and can't afford to pay for it.
The only industrialized country in the world that doesn't provide health care for all of its citizens.
That's right.
We are living in it. This is the same country where the death rate for newborns has gone up. This is the same country where we are stifling education. This is the same country. In the last few years, these things have happened, and they have happened because of an ideology that has taken power, that has really destroyed the American dream.
I think it's interesting, and you know, I follow, as you do, I know, follow all of this very closely. It does seem to me there are some people attracted to the Tea Party movement who do have a legitimate gripe about they want government to be more efficient, they want government to work better. But you also have this, I kind of call it the mythology movement, of a group of Americans in the Tea Party who seem to think that everything they got, they achieved without government. You know, never mind that they were educated in public schools, paid for by government, paid for by we the people, by taxpayers. They drive on highways in cars that are inspected to make sure that they're safe, paid for by the government. They fly the airways of this country in airplanes that are inspected by the FAA and an air traffic control system that keeps them from colliding each
How about
other.
pure food?
Paid for by the government. Food, medicine, you know, all sorts of things. We're reading in the newspaper even today about scandals involving, you know, debt collection practices where some of these companies are illegally hiring felons to engage in the debt collection business in our state of Minnesota.
It is a very effective way to collect debts, however.
Well, but we have
If you have
prohibitions
a
against
thug
that.
show up
Again, you have the role of
grab you
government.
by the
So
throat.
it's not that government can or should do everything, but certain things, I've never met anyone who said, no, I don't think the government should be involved in inspecting our food and medicine to make sure they're safe. I don't think the government should have any role whatsoever in protecting the environment. That's not where most Americans are at.
And yet, we have a movement in Congress to cut back on allotments to the Food and Drug Administration.
That's right. Right.
Instead of really enhancing it.
Right.
How many different events have we seen over the last 5 or 6
The
years?
E. coli breakouts and all kinds of
where people
things,
are
yeah.
dying because of the quality of the food, and certainly we just had another
Right.
one very recently.
Right. Yeah, well,
I only eat water now.
there's no calories in that,
That's
Alan.
right.
That's maybe a good thing.
And
Yeah.
no lettuce, no meat, no, you know, you don't know what to trust anymore.
Right. But I was going to say, I want to go back to your original question and just make an observation. You know, I know many people in the Tea Party movement and elsewhere are saying, well, you can't ever raise taxes on anybody or you're going to stifle the economy. I think, frankly, and I'm not alone, there are a number of reputable economists, people like Jared Bernstein at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Paul Krugman, New York Times frequent columnist, others who have said that what we really have is a drought of demand. There's very low consumer demand for a lot of things in this economy because people don't have money in their pockets. They're paying more for housing, they're paying
They're
more for energy,
so focused on
healthcare.
meeting the essentials.
Right.
Senior citizens who are using half the drugs. I know of a couple where the husband and wife were on the same drug. They switched every other day. They took half instead of each taking a full dose.
Yeah.
This is playing Russian roulette with your health.
Well, it is, and it ends up leading to more expensive interventions when people do have to get medical care. I just think I'm optimistic because I think we can do better than that as a country. We have done better than that. And there's no reason, you know, this kind of vision of, well, those who have the most should keep the most and get even more. We have a widening gap in this country, frankly, between the very wealthiest people and the people at the other end of the economic spectrum at the bottom. We need to find a way to inject money into this economy so that we create demand. That's what's going to cause employers to look up and say, there's demand for the goods and services that I sell. I'm going to hire some people to come work in my business. That's what does it. This idea that if you raise taxes a little bit on anybody, you're going to kill all of that. That's what he did.
In the 1930s, to break the Great Depression, he created the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Public Works programs,
and put people to work on highways and bridges and streets and things that were in need of improvement. Well, today, they're not only in need of improvement, but they're really in need of saving them.
You mentioned a subject dear to my heart when you mentioned the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. My grandfather was living in Minneapolis in the 1930s. He actually was in the CCC, and they helped to build the retaining wall along the east shore of Lake Calhoun. Part of that wall is still there. It's 70 years later, and it's there. But you know, when times were tough...
How about some of our dams and some of our bridges?
Some of the greatest public structures in America were built during the Great Depression. People forget that. You know, the Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and the Empire State Building and many of these other things that have lasted so long. And for us to say, well, no, all we can be doing here is cutting the role of government, cutting spending to put people back to work, and to respond to the economic crisis should not be acceptable. It's not who we are as a country.
You said one thing that I'll take exception to. You said that the greatest priority, I think, was to defeat health care, the Affordable Health Act. The greatest priority of many people in the legislature is to get Obama out of office.
Yeah.
Couldn't be more negative. Instead of talking about what we can do to improve this country, what we can do to get this country back on track, it's to destroy.
Well, what's ironic about that, of course, is that the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, I think President Obama, by this point, is convinced that they meant it when they said, we intend to make him a one-term president, to the point where they're even opposing things that they've previously supported before. For example, certain elements in the president's jobs package proposal, which he has pointed out, the president has pointed out, these are things they've been for.
Origin.
But now, because it's in this package with the president pushing it, they're suddenly opposed to it. That makes no sense, and I think that's what a lot of people in this country are sick and tired of, frankly. They want a government that's on their side and is working to get people back to work, is working to educate their kids, is trying to make sure that people have what they need to have a healthy, successful life.
The sleeping giant may be awakening in over 100 cities in this country this weekend.
Including Minneapolis.
Including Minneapolis, including Anchorage, including Oahu, Honolulu. People are starting to galvanize. People are starting to, it's not really fighting the banks, it's really fighting the philosophy that has taken this country and driven it into a ditch, and it's to drive it out of a ditch. People who are willing to be arrested for civil disobedience, even when they weren't being disobedient. Women who were pepper sprayed in New York, and
you know what's interesting, Alan?
appalling conduct.
You know what's interesting about that? How many people who were responsible for the economic meltdown that this country went through in 2008 and 2009, how many of them have been convicted of breaking the law? How many of them have been sentenced to prison? There were crimes committed, and this government needs to pursue that. They are starting to. The Justice Department is just now getting around to going after some of these people.
I'm very disappointed personally in the way Eric Holder has handled the Justice Department. There is a reason why Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld don't leave the country for speaking engagements and going on vacation where they could earn tremendous amounts of money, because they're afraid if they leave the country, they can be arrested as war criminals in so many of these countries for the two wars that are just draining us, both financially and philosophically, to say nothing of, as you mentioned, the tens of thousands of people who come back wounded and maimed, who only had the best interest of their country at heart, and yet get short shrift when they come back.
Right. And we have to do better by them. We should definitely be taking care of our veterans. I think the demonstrations that you talked about in these various cities, including now Minneapolis, it's a cry of people saying we want government to fight for us and to be on our side and to help us too. We've helped the big banks, we helped the auto industry, and I think we needed to do those things, don't get me wrong. I know they're controversial, but you know, it's very difficult for us to sit here today and to really speculate credibly on how much worse condition would we be in had we not done those things. I think it would have been considerably worse.
There's no question
but
that Obama's stimulus was so effective.
Well, there are many people that would argue. I actually wrote a blog about that showed that Minnesota alone took in $2.6 billion in stimulus money that went into the pockets of Minnesotans. And that money was regenerated in our economy. There is a strain of economists out there who argue, and I think with some merit, that actually maybe the stimulus was too small. You know, even Christine Romer, the former chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, she had raised that prospect that during the negotiations about the size of the package, that it needed to be bigger because the problem was much worse than some of the people in the administration had realized.
And I always felt that way.
Yeah.
But
it's a matter
it's
too.
hard to get
it's
your voice
difficult
heard.
Because you're trying to spend money in the most effective way, not just to throw money at it, but you want it to go into those things, those projects, infrastructure that's shovel ready, or to turn money around quickly so that you can get people out of the unemployment line and back on the job. So very tricky stuff, to be sure.
Steve Franscisco, always a pleasure. Once again, we have much more to cover, but it's always a learning experience to have you here. You've been here a lot of times with us.
A lot of times. I've lost count.
And I thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Good to be with you.